Hi, everyone. I'm Han Huel. I am your 2021 National AREAA Policy Chair. I think that's it. First off, it's Tuesday. It's actually Fat Tuesday, so happy Mardi Gras. Thank you so much for joining us. I just wanted to share a little bit about my committee and why we're doing this webinar for U.S. Government and Civic 101. So as you know, AREAA is the voice of the AAPI community for real estate professionals, and we've become kind of a powerful force with 17,000 members or so in 42 chapters throughout the US and Canada. My AREAA policy committee consists of 13 people representing different regions that we have chapters, and then 2 non-voting advisor, which is Rhonda in Hawaii and Rod in DC. And just to let you know what our mission is and why we do what we do. So we're here to advance AREAA vision of being the powerful national voice for AAPI to attain sustainable home ownership, because our home ownership rate just actually got over 60%, but it's not as high as Caucasian American. So we're trying to do that by reducing barriers such as language access, and while also strategically focusing on our 3 pillars, which is the strategic vision that AREAA has, which is leadership, membership, and partnership. So you can read a little bit about us, what we do, but in order to be better advocates, right? In order to lobby, and because a lot of us are immigrants that came to this country, never really had the US formal education or came after, we don't really know what the system is. We don't know how it works. We don't know why it's sometimes so crazy, why things don't get done at the federal government, what type of power the executive branch has, is it just writing executive order? Why is the legislative branch always in a deadlock? What does the Supreme Court do? So I'm super, super excited to bring you this webinar that discusses more about that, how the 3 branches work, and then also how we've become, kind of from the marginalized community to the margin of victory. And an example I'll give of that is the Orange County Congressional District in California. It was Republican, then switched to Democrat, then switched to Republican again. So we know that we are finally being heard, not necessarily being seen yet, as we've seen this past 2 weeks up to the Lunar New Year, which happy year of the ox, everyone, how we actually had to scream and just be vocal about what is happening in our community in order to even be seen and heard. So this is why this particular mission and what I do is so, so important to me, because until we recognize that we have to help ourselves and our community, no one else will do it for us. And so with that being said, I'm so excited to announce our first guest speaker, Nancy Chen. Nancy is a longtime Naperville, Illinois resident, first generation, and has basically dedicated her entire career to public service. So thank you, Nancy. I know not a lot of us as Asian American follow public service because our parents are very, more professional, traditional career. Nancy used to work also as the Asian outreach personnel for the White House Office of Presidential Personnel under the Clinton administration. And she's done a host of other things. Although she retired in 2010, she's still very, very active in her community. So I'll give it to Nancy to take it away to tell you about the 3 branches of government, how they work.
Hi, thank you, Han, for your introduction. And thank you, Vanessa and Carrie, for all your help. Happy Lunar New Year. I'm delighted to be here to present Government and Civic 101, and actually for our friend John Trishvina, who is the former Fair Housing Assistant Secretary. And John cannot be here today because he was just recently appointed by President Biden to be the principal legal advisor for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement of the Department of Homeland Security. But John sent his greetings to all of you. Well, as the introduction, Han's introduction, I am an immigrant myself, and I'm very proud to have such an extraordinary career opportunity, having served in the legislative branch and as well as the executive branch of the federal government. I began my public service career in the mid-80s when Asian Americans were just at the stage of awakening political participation and empowerment. So it is amazing to see that how much progress that we have made over the past 30 some years. And the fact that AREAA has dedicated itself in advancing political participation and empowerment for your members and actually for all of us. And this is a testament of progress. And you know, I read your documentation, the story of Asia America. That is so powerful, and a document that really tells where we were and where we want to be. And I congratulate you for such excellent work. So really, AREAA doesn't, as you mentioned that you were serving a voice for your members, actually you're serving a voice for all of us. I thank you. So for my presentation, I'm gonna more briefly walk you through the basics of the structure of our federal government, and then spend some time to talk about why or how each branch of the government can impact our community through legislation, executive orders, and of course, Supreme Court decisions. So without with that, Carrie's helping me with the PowerPoint. So and I see the PowerPoint is up. So the next page. The U.S. government. So the U.S. government under the U.S. Constitution is divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. And the reason for the framers of a constitution to do that is really to ensure that our government is effective and also that people's rights are protected. And although each branch has its own powers and responsibilities, but they're supposed to work together. Next slide. And here's a chart to show you, really, it's a wonderful thing to show how under the Constitution there are three branches, and I will go into more details about that. Next slide. So the legislative branch, and we call it Congress, and under the Congress there are two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Congress makes laws. For the executive branch, as you know, is to carry out the laws made by Congress. And for the judicial branch, the Supreme Court at the highest, and then there are the appeals courts and the district court, they interpret laws. Next slide. The key I would like you to take home with is that why do we have these three branches? It's actually the three branches to make sure that it provides a system of checks and balances. For example, the president can veto legislation created by Congress. And you may have already heard the past year that Congress wanted to do certain bills, but the former President Trump would threaten, I'm going to veto them. And if the bill actually has more than 2/3 of members supporting the bill, it's called veto proof. That means even the president vetoed the bill is still passed. So that is one way for the check and balances for the executive branch. However, Congress confirms or rejects the nominations by the president for Supreme Court nomination, for his cabinet members, and a lot of other nomination ambassadors and such. And for the Supreme Court can overturn any laws that's deemed unconstitutional. Next slide. And next slide. So let's talk about Congress. Congress has the power to make laws, declare war, and raise, that means raise taxes, and also it has oversight about the federal government. And the other point I want to mention is that all the congressional offices actually provide constituent services. And I'm sure that a lot of you have used them. If you have not, then make sure that if you raise your grievances, that you heard anything unjust, especially if you're having problems with a federal agency on certain things, whether it's immigration or Social Security, Medicare, or your congressional member, the office, especially the district office, they handle that. And oftentimes they can really help you to resolve the issue. So the Senate has 2 senators from each state. And so there are 100 senators. And for the House of Representatives, there are 435 House representatives from 50 states. And it's allocated by population. So the states with larger populations get more House of Representatives than the states that with fewer. The next slide. Let's start with House of Representatives. There are 2 main duties, and that is make law and also have the oversight of the government, how the government works. Also, it has several exclusive powers. The power to initiate revenue bills, that means increase or decrease taxes, taxing bills. And power also to impeach, witness already starting from last December. And then also the part that we have probably heard is that in the case of a tie, of an electoral college tie, actually the House members get to elect the president. Next slide. About the Senate. The Senate, of course, approves also the bills that came from the House of Representatives. But also it has the exclusive power of confirm or reject nominations from the president for president's cabinet members, ambassadors, federal judges, as well as Supreme Court. And the other important thing is that the Senate approves treaties with other countries. And also the most important thing, and what we just witnessed last week, is that the Senate tries to reach. Next slide. For the executive branch, of course, the executive branch carries out and enforces law. It includes the president, vice president, the cabinet, executive departments, and independent agency, and many other boards, commissions, and next slide. And the highest office of the executive branch, of course, is the White House. What does the president do? Of course, we know the president leads the country, and he represents the country, or she is the head of state, also the leader of the federal government. And also, the president is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. For the vice president, he or she, and she at this point supports the president. If the president is unable to serve, the vice president becomes the president. Also, another fact that is not mentioned here is that the vice president also serves as the president of the Senate. Now, she, and I'm going to use she at this point, she doesn't get the vote. She doesn't get to vote Senate. However, when there's a tie, 50 and 50, she gets to cast the deciding vote. And for the cabinet, of course, cabinet members serve as advisor to the president, and it includes the vice president, and also heads of department and other high-ranking government. And cabinet members are nominated by the president and by the Senate. Right now, we still have quite a few cabinet members, department secretaries of the departments that have not been confirmed. They're waiting to be. I hope it's soon. Next slide. There are 15 federal agencies, and of course, the head of the agency we call the cabinet members. Next slide. I just wanted to show you all the federal agencies, but I know the one that you probably work with the most is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I'm sure you have Department of Justice or even Homeland Security and so on and so forth. Okay, next slide. Judicial branch. Often we talk about Supreme Court, but actually Judicial Branch has 3 different courts, and they are Supreme Court, the highest one, and the Federal Courts of Appeals and Federal District. They interpret the meaning of laws, bylaws to individual cases, and decide if laws violate the Constitution. Next slide. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States, and the justices are nominated by the president, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate. There are 9 members for the Supreme Court, 8 justices and 8 other associate justices. And they are lifetime appointments, so they can serve until either they die or retire, or in very rare cases, be removed. Next slide. And this is just a photo, as you know, that because it is very important, and Supreme Court often interprets the law and actually make decisions, that these days a lot of people go to the Supreme Court or to protest or to support. So this is, okay, next slide. So here I wanted to share with you why the legislation, executive orders, Supreme Court decisions are very important, and I selected a few cases that actually impacted our community since the 1800s. And the first one is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. That was the law that specifically the very first and probably only discriminatory law against a specific ethnic group, Chinese, which prohibited Chinese from entering the United States and also becoming citizens. This law was not revoked until 1943, when China was an ally with the United States fighting against the Nazis and Japan. So this is something, of course, is always a blemish for the history of the United States. So this is a negative law that impacted our community. The next one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Although this is not particularly addressed for Asian Americans, but Asian Americans and like ourselves should still benefit from this, because the law prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, and gender. And in the law, the Title VII of the law also prohibits discrimination on these bases in hiring, promoting, and firing. So it is a very important landmark decision, that landmark law that helps actually all of us, whether you are Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and women, they all benefit from the fight after 1965. And the other very important case, 1965, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, I'm going to have to say that I am a beneficiary of the law. I came after that. And my husband came, in fact, he applied for under the third preference in those days, third preference, people with specific skills and in science, math, technology, that they, at that time, they could actually self-petition to become permanent resident. So this one, and the important about this act was that it abolished the national quota, which was heavily for the European countries, and became that allowing a set of numbers for every country around the world. Also, the other important thing is enters on family reunification, so that you can bring your parents, your children, and actually at that time still your brothers and sisters. So actually the Asian population grew after 1965 at a much faster pace than prior. And another legislation is the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and that was a result of having Japanese American community and all Asian American communities and others lobbied to pass that. So Congress actually apologized and paid reparation to Japanese Americans who were hurt. Next slide. And I want to talk some executive order. The most infamous executive order, of course, was the 1966 issued by President Roosevelt during World War II to relocate all Japanese Americans to internment camps in 1942. And the law that I mentioned in 1988 was the one that should redress the wrongs and to say we apologize for the wrongs that we've done to Japanese Americans. So that was an effort by our community, by a lot of people, to overturn this. Oh, well, it wasn't overturned, to actually make a policy. And here, I also know that President Biden recently had an executive orders, or we call a memorandum, condemning and combating racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States, especially due to COVID. And then we have another memorandum on redressing our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. And this particular addresses disparate impact that was later. And this is also issued by President Biden. So the rules. Next slide. Of the Supreme Court cases that I want to mention, that actually all three cases were done by Chinese Americans who fought all the way to the Supreme Court and won. So the first one is Bilingual versus Hopkins, and this is 1886. It was the San Francisco initiated a laundry license that was supposed to apply to all laundry owners, but they only applied to Chinese American laundry owners. And the Chinese American challenged the law all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's decision was that this violated the Equal Protection Clause, 14th Amendment. He won, and because of him, that this disparate impact theory has been used now by women, by racial minorities, and others. And like you said, even in the housing area, fair housing area. Another one that a key landmark decision is United States versus Wong Kim Ark. You may have heard about that, you may not have, but I know a lot of people benefit from the birthright citizenship. And that was because Wong Kim Ark, who was born in the United States, went back to China. Upon his return, they rejected him and said he wasn't. And he challenged all the way to the Supreme Court. One, again, under the 14th Amendment, granting birthright citizenship, all persons born in the United States. And right now, this decision is employed by not just Asian Americans, it's by immigrants, all the people who came to this country and children born in this. And the last one is probably less known, is that a lot of people wonder how bilingual education started. It actually was started by the decision on Law versus Nichols. It was by a Chinese student who didn't speak English. And again, this case went to the Supreme Court and decided that there actually established that bilingual education should be offered for non-English students. Next slide. So in conclusion, I want to talk about what can you do to increase your political empowerment, your participation. First is that encourage each individual to actively participate in civic and political process. And let your voice heard by voting. And that is very important, whether it's a local, state, or federal level, because at democracy, every vote counts. And it's evidenced by the last election. Every vote really is, it matters. The other lesson we learned from the Supreme Court decisions is that you have the right to petition your government and also exercise your collective powers, such as AREAA. Whether it's a professional group or it's a community group, that we band together to ask for, whether it's for justice or equal protection, And I wanted to actually conclude this by sharing an experience that I had. I don't think we have time to talk about state and local governments at this point, but what I did last year was that during the height of the pandemic and during the height of anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian racial attacks around the country, there were two incidents happened in my own city, Naperville. One man who was out jogging, a Chinese American, was attacked by two women and just not only threw something at him, but called him to go back to China. And the other one was a woman made a statement at a city council meeting to call Chinese Americans in Naperville carpetbaggers and foreigners and so on and so forth. I was very upset and I thought something had to. I talked to my city council members people that I know. And I said, perhaps what we can do is for the city council members to condemn this kind of racism. And I offer that if I can draft a resolution, it worked. And so I drafted a resolution for them. And I read it at the city council. They adopted the resolution. And so basically the resolution condemned anti-Asian racism, and then also to support the Asian community and to assure that Naperville City is an inclusive and diverse community for all. So that, I just want to say, this is something you can do at your local community. But of course, by doing so, it helps that you know your city council members and that you know your mayors. And this goes to the part about activities. And as realtors, I'm sure you have even more contacts and others that you can help you to achieve that. So I really thank you for this opportunity to present the Government 101, and I wish you great success for the new year. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Chen, Executive Director for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. Thank you so much to AREAA for hosting this event and just being a tremendous partner with API Vote during the 2020 election cycle. It really, the accomplishments that we were able to make to ensure that our community was counted in the 2020 census, as well as being seen and heard and overperform in our 2020 election results, was really a collective effort of all the communities weighing in last cycle. So I want to go ahead and talk a little bit in terms of what we were able to accomplish. And some of this you've probably had already seen, but I just wanted to make sure as we start this discussion, I always say that just because election day is done, that does not mean that our work stops there. It's really about making sure that our elected officials understand how we did turn out and holding them accountable to the issues that we care about as they continue to govern, whether it's at the local level, state, as well as the federal level. So, wanted to point out that the voter turnout in presidential battleground states, the API community actually was known to overperform relative to 2016. And this was only in the early vote stages. And in majority of all the battleground states, our early vote turnout actually surpassed their 2016 turnout overall. So that was a huge accomplishment for us to see that. As you see here, it was over a 300% increase in Asian American early votes overall. And here you'll see the breakdown by age group. But as you can see, like all the ages actually overperformed and did a lot better than the last presidential cycle. Here, especially what we're really glad to see is 18 to 29-year-olds increased by 310%, the largest increase. Typically, this age bracket has the lowest voter registration and turnout rate. So we start to see this shift in the 2018 midterm elections. And I'm really glad to see that they were able to do a lot more and overperform than any other age group in 2020. Looking at Georgia, since all eyes were on Georgia after November, in the general elections, the API community in Georgia represented about 2.7% of their share of votes. And this is something that I want to point out, just because the share of votes is not necessarily about your population size or even just voter registration, but it's also about overall turnout. So if we're able to continue to overperform, but let's say other communities don't perform at the same levels as they did in the past, we can actually increase our share of the votes. So here in the 2020 general elections, we had a high of 2.7%, which is an increase over the 2016 and 2018 numbers. And here is a chart where you actually will see 2016, 2018, 2020 general elections, and then compare it to the 2021 runoff. So what we were really proud to see was that in the runoff, the Georgia API community made up 2.5% compared to 2.7% in the November elections, which is a huge feat because usually runoffs are a lot harder to motivate people to actually turn out. And here, this is once again, you can see the history in broader terms of like how we perform. Like I said, 1.7 to 1.8, then to a high of 2.7 in the in the general elections, and then 2.5 in January. And then one other recap I want to do is once again focusing on the 18 to 29-year-olds. So 18 to 29-year-olds from the November elections to the January runoffs, they actually increased their turnout and their participation rate. So it's really great to see that considering during a runoff, it's usually have a decrease, but they actually were able to increase their participation in comparison to others. The other thing that was mentioned was Orange County. This is where I want to go ahead and talk about how we can be a margin of victory in these elections, not only in the presidential battleground state, but also in specific areas. Orange County is a great place to introduce this narrative because here it was actually every vote really did count, and it really was dependent on the voters' relationship with a particular candidate. In Orange County, they had overwhelmingly had voted for Joe Biden, which was a Democrat. But then in the congressional races, you'll see that Michelle Steele and Young Kim, who are Republicans, won their races, yet Alan Lowenthal, who's the Democrat, also won his race. So, once again, it was margins of like 4,800 to 9,900. So when you have such a large population, we're a sizable piece of the electorate in those counties, we can continue to be a margin of victory, essentially. And that was on the congressional race. Then when you look at the state Senate race, you had Josh Newman and Dave Min, who were the Democrats, actually win their elections, even in the same district where you had Young Kim and Michelle Steele win as Republicans. So that's why I was saying it really is dependent in terms of one's relationship, especially for the API electorate, with a particular candidate. But these margins are so close, and that's why it's really important for us to continue to share that narrative with our elected officials and political parties. So that way, as we continue to advocate on issues, they understand that they need to continue to address and engage our community and our base of growing voters as well. So, that turns into like the whole conversation, like how do we make government work for you? Nancy has really provided a great context in terms of how each of the different branches really work together. But this is where I also wanted to point out that there are different asks that we have of local government, municipal government, versus like the federal level. So here, at the federal level, last year at the presidential town hall, Joe Biden had talked about the rise in attacks against Asian Americans and made some promises there. He started to go ahead and fulfill that initially with this executive order, but now it's up to our organizations to continue to ask his administration, work with the Department of Justice, and really get clarification. What does the executive order do? How does that actually provide DOJ more resources, or are there going to be more reinforcement? What are some other best practices that you can go ahead and share with local governments from the federal level to ensure that Asian Americans are protected? At the local level, as you've seen in terms of, especially this past weekend, the wonderful organizing of local community organizations working with and holding their government in Oakland and San Francisco accountable, asking that this is one that it's also not just about Asian Americans, but this is also a broader issue in terms of how we as communities of color need to come together to actually prevent these hate crimes from happening. But also in terms of how do you address the underlying reasons for why these attacks are actually happening, right? And so these are things that you're going to have a different type of ask when you're addressing your city council and your mayors or your local police departments, right? So I just wanted to flag that as an example as we head on. But that actually leads into what API Vote is focusing on for 2021. It really is about not having our voters vote once every 4 years or even once every 2 years. It's about also engaging in local elections. So really, especially for states like Virginia, where we have elections every year, we really want to not only bring in more Asian Americans to become voters, but then to have them turn out on a regular basis. So that way they are seen as high propensity voters. And then as a result, the candidates are going to go ahead and pay attention to them a lot more. So this year on the state level, we see there's the state executive, the legislative branch, and also in some states, the judicial branches are also elected. At the municipal level, once again, it's all by region. You have places like mayors or county races, city council, school board, boards and commissions, and judges. Here I will also want to uplift some different examples in terms of how these different municipal elections and how these elected officials impact our lives on a day-to-day basis, right? School board members are the ones that are going to determine the policies on how best to open up the schools and get our kids back during this pandemic. Right now, also tied to school education, it's all about access to technology. Are there enough mobile phone towers, or is internet regulated by the city council? Also, during this time period, I think many of us are also utilizing our different parks as much as we can to go out and get some fresh air. But city councils can also tell parks and recs to include table tennis, badminton, and cricket facilities, things that may be more popular with the Asian American households. City planners also determine a homeowner if they want to remodel their house, and they are essentially appointed by their mayors or city council member. Local libraries are funded by city council, whether or not they could have enough funds to keep it open 7 days a week for a place for kids to study, especially those that don't have access to the internet. And then, local lawmakers also determine zoning laws to determine housing density. So there's a wide variety of reasons of why we need to dig a little bit deeper and really educate the API community in terms of the functions of these different local elected officials, especially now that people are paying attention on a day-to-day basis, because it's all about how local government is also helping us get through this pandemic. So here I want to also go ahead and note some of the state elections that are happening this year. So for those of you in New Jersey and Virginia, you have the governor's race as well as the state legislative elections. At the judicial level, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Washington, and Wisconsin have those actually on deck. And then at the municipal level, this is where I was like saying this is about city council, mayor races, boards and commissions. It really varies from state to state. Ballotpedia is actually in the process of updating a lot of this. So this is where you could continue to look back as things progress. But I wanted to at least flag this for you. And I will share this PowerPoint with AREAA, so then that way they can share it with all the participants here today. So that way you could go back and take a look at this. And as you can see, it really does vary in terms of the states of like what is up for local elections. And then overall, a lot of school boards are actually up for re-elect and so it really varies from state to state. But this is also another opportunity for us to really, engage people, because our community is really paying attention to how our elected officials are performing as it impacts their daily lives. So this is another opportunity to once again remind them that there are local elections. What we found in working in quote unquote off year elections is that many times when we contact voters, they actually did not realize that there was a local election happening. So whatever we could do to normalize that and make them understand that there are local elections happening in their backyard. Another area that I want to flag for all of you in terms of getting involved is the redistricting process. So, last year it was all about, getting counted through the 2020 census. And a lot of that impacts in terms of what type of political representation we actually get. And that actually is determined by the redistricting process that happens state by state. And every state, it really does differ, because some of them are independent commissions or political commissions that determine the redrawing of the lines. Others, it's actually done, a majority of them are actually done by the legislative branch at the state level. But what exactly is redistricting? So each district must have the same number of residents. So here you'll see is like back in 2010, lines were drawn. So then that way each congressional district or each state district, state representative district has essentially the same number of residents. So here you have as an example of having 5. But then over time, as we know, people are going to move. So it becomes uneven in terms of size. In one district, you have a reduction of 4 to 7. And then so every 10 years, once we have the census count, the district lines have to be redrawn to make each district even in size again. And so this year, a lot of the data we were hoping for it to come out earlier, but now we were told that the census data will come out for redistricting in September. So this is the process that we will be seeing, where they will redraw these different lines. Now, in terms of how shapes are drawn will impact in terms of how elections are really counted. There are going to be different people and different entities involved with redistricting. Some may come from a political angle where they want to make it an advantage for Democrats or Republicans. For the community, many times it really is about communities of interest. Many times by having it be as close as it being half and half Democrat and Republican, it can actually help us in terms of making sure that when every vote does get counted, that we could be a margin of victory, right? But this is whenever redistricting is done, this is what the map will look like, and it impacts us for an entire decade, for 10 years. So here is an example in terms of how whether or not minorities can have a say in the outcome of elections. So here is an example where minorities only make up a quarter of each of them in each of the 4 districts. But in example 2, with the same population, you could go ahead and redraw the line so that way minorities are actually brought together, or communities of interest, and so they make up 3/4 of a district. So these are the different things that we are encouraging that our API community organizations and leaders also get involved. I think in the past, our population wasn't large enough, but now the last 20 years, we've seen that redistricting is no longer an issue for API communities on the East and West Coast, but now we have areas like Minnesota, Nevada, the South of Georgia, Atlanta, North Carolina, where there are growing populations and where we can work with other communities of color to actually redraw the lines and making sure that we have proper representation. Even in New York, where there was a sizable population for the longest time, for decades, there was no API member of Congress ever elected because of the way the lines were drawn. So here, the first map that you see on the left is from 2000, where Congressional District 6, which is now Congresswoman Grace Meng's district, it was drawn in a way where the API community wasn't actually cohesive in one location. So after the 2010 census, the New York API community got organized and was involved with the redistricting process. And as a result, the map on the right-hand side is now the new lines for Congressional District 6. And then shortly after that, Congresswoman Grace Meng was able to run for office and win her election, and now is serving as the first Asian American to serve in Congress for this within New York. So for the redistricting timeline, there are different ways to get involved. For a large bulk of our community, API Vote is going to be looking to working with many of you in 28 states to do an initial survey of communities and planning. So this is where we can actually get you involved with community interest mapping. What that means is, like, we could go to you, especially AREAA, where the Asian grocery store, where there is a growing population of the Vietnamese community or the Hmong community or Filipino community. We will actually go through a map and actually ask you to help us tell us what street, what county level, what area should I be noting that this is where the Hmong community is, or there's a low income communities of color in this particular area. By being able to identify the changing movement of our communities, we're able to then provide these maps to a broader coalition in that state. And so that way district lines can be drawn in a way, and we'll also be able to work with different legal organizations that will be helping us draw those maps and as well as evaluate those maps. Another way where AREAA members and different API community leaders can get involved is really about testifying in terms of the importance of making sure that your community is actually held together and how that actually impacts your community and getting the proper services and representation that you need for from your local government. So I just wanted to flag that we're going to be planning our Norman Y. Mineta leadership trainings, focusing on redistricting by state. This will essentially happen around the spring and summer time period. They'll be scheduled throughout those like 5 or 6 month time periods. So then that way we do all of our homework. So then that way by September 30th, when the census data releases the redistricting data, a lot of the initial scans of where our communities are located will already be done. And so just wanted to flag in terms of how you could actually be involved, especially in your role of understanding where these communities are moving to. And then the other thing I also wanted to flag with you is that because you have clients that are moving and buying houses and relocating, I would also encourage you, since we're saying that voting really needs to be done on a regular basis, year to year, to really try to incorporate voter registration into your everyday process to all your clients. Perhaps it can be part of the closing process or other processes when you're interfacing with your clients. Also, another way for you to also get involved are different boards and commissions on the local level that can actually impact different policies decisions that this community actually cares about or are of interest for AREAA. One thing I do want to flag about voter registration is that it does really vary from state to state in terms of the process and the different deadlines. There has been a lot more movements where API Vote has been working with local partners and local governments to change their systems to online voter registration. We saw a lot of that movement happen, especially with the pandemic, that more states were willing to move to online voter registration. But then we also have seen that same-day registration, like in Minnesota and North Carolina, these new type of processes actually allow our community, who many times have not necessarily paid attention to the elections and to the very last moment. And in the past, for states where they actually have to register like 30 days beforehand, they'll call our hotline and then we actually have to tell them that they have to wait into the next election because they were not registered. But for states that have same-day registration, we've seen the increase of participation from our communities. Minnesota has one of the highest voter registration and participation rates overall in the country, as well as within the API community. And I really believe a lot of that is because of same-day registration. Pre-registration is for, in some areas, 16-year-olds can go ahead and pre-register. So then that way, by the time they turn 18, they're already automatically registered. And then in some states, they are already through the DMV identifying those that are US citizens and 18 years and older and automatically registering them through their process. Due to the National Voter Registration Act that was passed about 2 decades ago, what we've seen is that 33% of all voter registrations actually originate from the DMV. But what we've also learned is that any place that is engaging with clients on a regular basis, if we can incorporate voter registration into our everyday process, that can actually help us increase the registrations within our community. But one thing I also want to flag is that after the 2020 elections, there are efforts, especially in the South. We've already seen this in Georgia, where they're trying to place voting restrictions to make it harder to vote. That includes eliminating no excuse absentee voting, requiring voter ID for absentee voting, and outlawing ballot drop boxes, which we know these are the strategies that were really helpful this election cycle to really get the turnout rate that we got at the historic numbers. So with that, hopefully that gives you a basic idea in terms of different ways how you can make local government be effective to you, but also ways that you could get involved and why it is really important for all of us to actually participate in the 2021 election cycle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. Sorry, like I didn't introduce you properly, but Christine is an amazing, amazing person that puts on together events and helping activate and organize for our community. She's the founding executive director of API Vote, which, you know, AREAA and API Vote has been partners for a long time. This past year, we did, you know, the US Census video, and then I personally have gone to Michigan to register voters and did the US Census last February with her organization, API Vote Michigan. So thank you so much. There's 2 questions. I think one, either Nancy or Christine can answer. Vicky Savano asked, what's the difference between an executive order and memorandum, and how do the implementation and effectiveness of these 2?
My understanding, executive order is actually to be carried out with action, telling the federal agency branches to immediate to start what the president has said according to an order. And the very good example was that 1966 relocation of Japanese Americans, and executive order that President Trump issued also say banning Muslims from entering, such as memorandum is more like an advice that we would like to get the awareness for the federal agencies to do this. And I guess, and Christine, you can help me, is that I kind of feel memorandum does not have teeth. Executive order has teeth, that it actually requires action. Memorandum is to advise you that you should be cognizant, you should be aware, you should be doing that, but there's no enforcement. Christine, I mean, is that your understanding is?
That is my understanding. And, you know, like for instance, now with the executive orders, this allows us to go to Department of Justice and say, okay, this was, you know, provided by President Biden. So, you know, what are you specifically doing as it's related to this executive order?
And that's the reason why when I presented the proper one is called memorandum. It didn't say executive order, although I know some people call it executive order. But if it's an executive order, they actually have to order federal agency to do something. And as Christine mentioned, that we actually need to follow up. What are you going to do about this? Because it's only a memorandum.
Thank you so much. And then the second question, I'm not even sure if y'all have any, if we don't have the data, how has the AAP, and this is for Christine, how has the AAPI census turnout increased or decreased for 2020?
Yeah, so I saw that. So I went ahead and I dropped a link. So overall, the 2020 census response rate between self-response and then the Census Bureau going door to door, it was 99.98% complete nationwide. But there is the caveat is that what we heard, the initial analysis is that large cities still have a sizable undercount compared to 10 years ago. So we're really a lot more concerned in terms of how this is going to impact larger cities. And we know the API community, we typically gravitate and live in those larger municipal areas. So we will have to see how the US Census will adjust in dealing with those undercounts.
I'll be also interested to note, because of the pandemic, a lot of people like moved back from where they were currently living, if that's how it will impact the census count. And then Mei Ling had a question, and I think this is more for branches of government. When the president veto a legislation, is that the final step, or can the House overturn it?
Well, as I mentioned, if the president vetoes, which the president doesn't do very often, but usually the president probably has done in his term 6 or 7, you could veto it, and it goes back to Congress. Then the Congress has to decide would they have enough vote to overturn the veto. And if 2/3 of the members of each house actually say no, we still want this to pass, then they ignore, and then they can still pass it, and the president can't do anything. But it requires 2/3 of the vote. So that's why often it's actually difficult. If the president veto is more likely, it's gonna die.
Recent one, wasn't that President Trump veto budget bill, or I think, right? And then it went to Congress and they passed it.
They passed it, yes. Pretty rare, but that was why, yeah.
So I promised that I don't think there's any more questions. I promised that I would give my dark care package. So in the Facebook comments or in our chat, if you can give, whoever gives me the fact they learned today, I will pick that person and I will send you a care package full of moon pies, doubloons, and beads for all of y'all to experience the wonderfulness that is Mardi Gras, which is founded in my hometown of Alabama. So just a little nugget. And then our next event, or the next big event we're having for national, is called the Fair Housing and Diversity Summit on April 28th and 29th. I hope to see everyone there. We're having a great lineup. Lisa Nguyen of the AREAA Denver, she's the past president, immediate past president for AREAA chapter, AREAA Greater Denver. It's co-hosting it or co-chairing it with Fred Underwood of NAR. and I'm super excited about it. It's 2 days event, again, usually probably 2 to 3 hours each day with a great lineup, and we'll have more information as we get closer to that. And then our virtual policy summit will probably, and it's virtual because everything is still going on, will probably be, I wouldn't say June. I don't know if we could do it in May, even though May is API Heritage Month, but June is Home Ownership Month. So thank you so much for joining. I hope you learned a lot of information, you took a lot of information and exercises and process it, and then disseminate it. And as always, I'm gonna just leave this here. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.